Throughout the self-defense techniques at this belt rank, you'll see us use what's called a fixing technique. This is a way to control your opponent when they're on the ground and make them not a threat to you. Some of these fixing techniques, you can release one hand so that you're only holding them with one hand and a knee, while the other hand is free to be able to grab your radio, call for help, or grab handcuffs to lock your opponent out. There's going to be some fixing techniques that you'll use if they're on their face, some if your opponent's laying on your back, and a few different ones if they're laying on their side. We'll even show you a few ways to control them between those three different positions. When your opponent goes to their back, you've got a couple of different options. Both options are really pretty much the same. It's just the orientation that's slightly different. What you're looking at is I could be below his shoulders or I could be above his shoulders. I've got the same exact fixing techniques if I'm on that side of the body. It's no different. First thing I want to look at is the orientation of his arm. Now, if his palms are facing up, I can lean on his arm. All he's getting is a nice little massage. What I want to focus on is getting his palm down towards the floor. Now his arms will turn in two ways. There's one way that's really comfortable for him to turn that way. I turn his hand, no problem. Again, I lean on his arm. It doesn't affect him. The technique I did to take him down was an outside wrist lock, and it's already turning this way. So if you're doing this as an outside wrist lock, easiest thing is you just complete that technique all the way to the point where you put his palm on the floor. Once the palm's on the floor, you'll notice that's not a comfortable position for him. Even when I push on the pinky side, that starts to cause a little bit of discomfort for him. Also, you'll notice I can slip my hand right under here. There's space, and now if I lean on that spot, it feels like I'm going to dislocate his elbow. The ground, though, is flat, so I'm going to hyperextend it, but it's probably not going to dislocate. The biggest advantage is if I can have this hand close to me, I can now take my knee and put it on the elbow. I can put all my body weight on it. I'm hardly putting any weight, and he still has space under his elbow. He's already in pain. But if I can use one hand and one knee, this hand can grab a tool. Technique is the same if something happens and I end up on this side of his body. Notice I'm above his shoulders instead of below his shoulders. I could still put his hand this way and still lock up his arm, but look at where my head's facing. He could reach up and kick me in the head. So if I'm above his shoulders, I want to take his hand above his head. Now from this position, you'll notice I still have that same space underneath him. But now when I go to put my knee on his elbow, my butt's facing towards him. So if he goes to kick up, he's going to hit the big muscles of my butt or my lower back. And I can still just apply a little bit more pressure and reach down like honk. A common fixing technique comes from this outside wrist lock. Now, as we mentioned before, if I can, I want to try to get his arm stretched out so I can kneel on the back of the elbow. But the outside wrist lock itself is a very painful wrist lock, and a lot of times they're going to try to fight you for it and pull their hand in close. And I don't want to use a lot of strength wrestling to get his arm out there. I'm going to make myself tired. Remember, Hapkido is like water. I don't want to resist my opponent. I instead want to flow with my opponent. So if he's pulling his hand down, I'm going to push his hand down with it. I'm going to try to push his hand right next to his ear. Now as you watch the elbows, I push the hand close to the floor, the elbow comes out in front of me. At this point, I can take whatever hand I have free and press the back of his hand into the floor, and I'm pushing the elbow up towards the floor as well. This creates a lot of pain in the wrist and up through the arm. Now right now I'm doing this from a kneeling position. If I was really doing this from this joint lock here, I would be standing up and I would switch into a horse stance from this position. And you could use either hand depending on which hand you want to go for a tool with. Sometimes you might end up with a weird grip on the hand, like we did a downward four-finger lock at one particular point. From here to get to any one of my other fixing techniques, outside of putting his hand next to his ear and pushing his elbow down, I'm going to have to do a lot of moving. So there are some other options. If I've got a hold of the palm side of his fingers, I'm going to start with pointing his fingers towards his nose and then pointing it down towards his belt. Now I can isolate this further by my free hand grabbing a hold of his wrist, or I can reach my other hand down to the mat so he can't move his elbow, and I can create a lot of pain that way as well. One thing you want to be aware of is him punching you there. So if I put a little bit of pressure on his rib with my knee, that's going to keep him from rolling over. And as he starts to move, I'll just apply more pressure on his fingers, and that's going to change his mind about wanting to do what he's doing. The other way is if I've got a hold of the back of his hand instead. I've got the same lock, but this one I started from his nose pointing towards him, and I pointed down for his belt. If I have a hold of the back of his hand, I'm going to start with his fingers pointing away from him, and then I'm going to point up towards his head. It's not going to go that far. Same thing, I can isolate the wrist with the other hand, or by gripping all the way down and pinning his elbow to the mat. There's a couple of the positions where you're going to end up on the side of your opponent. This one was from an outside wrist lock, but you could certainly be going for an arm bar and it gets botched up and he's laying on his side now. Either way, what I need to do is transition to a figure 4 arm lock. If I'm from this arm bar position, it's pretty easy. All I have to do is slide my free arm up into his elbow and then put pressure on his wrist to grab a hold of my own forearm. I'm lifting his wrist up and pulling his elbow towards my chest. Then what makes this a fixing technique is that one knee is leaning on his face, the other knee is leaning on his elbows, or on his ribs. So my knees are pressing down while my hands are pulling up, and that immobilizes him. If I'm doing this from something different, like an outside wrist lock, I'm going to have to transition to that point. If you do transition, you want to make sure to control the hand first. This one I can use either hand. I'll use my right hand, I can turn it around, grab a hold of his knuckles. Then I'll squeeze my other hand down to his elbow and bend it to grab a hold of my wrist. If I did that backwards, I could certainly grab with my left hand, reach my right hand inside and grab a hold of the elbow too. The main key is that either way, I'm pulling the wrist straight up and the elbow into my chest, and I'm giving it a little bit of a hug. From this point, you've got a couple of points you can transition into. Once you've got the lock, you can let go of the elbow to be able to grab the tool. I've still got the hand, so I've got control of his pain. So there's a couple of times that you're going to end up with your opponent on their stomach. This is actually the most advantageous place to have your opponent. When they're on their stomach, their body doesn't bend backwards, so it's going to be harder for them to stand up, harder for them to grab various tools like knives or guns. So the first thing I want to show you is that you've got the same exact option from this as if he was on his back. What I'm going to do is take his palm the same way, I'm going to put it down onto the floor. Then that creates a little bit of space underneath his elbow. From there, all I have to do is kneel on the back of his arm, and that creates a lot of pain. If something happened in the armbar and I found myself on this side of him, the same thing works. As long as I've got this palm face flat towards the floor, I can kneel with this knee and cause that same kind of pain. Now, one of the disadvantages of me being down on my knees, I can't move as fast. At least I can still see the battlefield. If I need to roll over the top of him, if I need to stand up and run, I can. But if I'm already standing up, it'd be advantageous for me to stay on my feet. So I've got a couple of options. Once I finish this armbar, I can take my near leg and step over the top of him, and I'm going to take my knee and put all my body weight onto his shoulder. Right now I've got his wrist, and I'm pulling his arm backwards into my knee. I've got an armbar right here. If I end up on this side of him, all I have to do is leave my near foot now next to his head. My far foot is just going to step over to come to the same position. This time I wanted to show you how I reached up to grab the back of his hand. If I've got the back of his hand, I've got a very painful wrist lock if I'm pushing my palm down towards his shoulder. So now my knee goes to his shoulder, my palm goes to his shoulder, and now I've got the ability to grab a weapon or the ability to let him go and run away. Let's talk about how I can transition my opponent between being on their back, their side, or their stomach. Like I said earlier, the stomach is the most advantageous position for me. That gives him the least amount of tools available while I still have everything available to me. If I am taking him down to his back, though, one of the things you want to point out is how close he is to my legs. If I'm in this position next to his ribs and I've got a hold of his hand, I want to, as quick as possible, get to the position of his hand down and me on his elbow. If I don't get there quick enough and he turns towards me and grabs a hold of my legs, if I don't know how to grapple, I'm in a lot of trouble right now. But on the other hand, instead of turning into me, if he instead tries to sit up, I can just follow his motion all the way around to get him onto his stomach. Let me show you how I did that again. My number one point, like I said earlier, if I'm taking him down this way, is to get his hand on the floor and my knee on the elbow. So my knee's already going that direction. As he sits up, all I do is I take my right hand, transfer across his knuckles, I pull his arm around my leg, and I push on his head. Notice this foot has stayed in the same spot. I'm just following him with this leg, all the way to where he's on his stomach. Then I kneel into his shoulder. If I've got a hold of his wrist, that's okay. If I can get his wrist bent, that's even better. So now on the other hand, if he's laying on his back, and I've got control of him here, and instead he tries to roll over to his side, I don't want to step all the way over him right now because now he can grab a hold of my legs. So if he's trying to roll over to his side, I'm going to transition to a side control position. There's a couple ways you can get there. If I'm already here, as soon as he starts to go, I'm going to switch a hand and then get my figure 4 locked into his elbow. Just like I did earlier, I could also switch it the other way. He's rolling to his side, I can switch this hand and then come into his elbow. Both works out the same way, just make sure you pull up. As I'm kneeling and pulling up, if he wants to roll over to his stomach, I'm not going to fight him and try to hold him here. I'll go with him and try to get back to this position. Again, this is exactly where I want him to end up anyways, on his stomach.